Scary telling.
As a child, I heard the cries of a woman every night, without fail. The sound was piercing, ear-shattering, and frightening to me. It always seemed to come from outside my window, and I could never figure out where it was coming from. At first, I thought it was just a random noise or a figment of my imagination. But night after night, the crying woman's wails were there, keeping me up and filling me with dread. I tried to tell my parents about it, but they dismissed it as just a bad dream. The crying woman became a constant presence in my life. Every night, as soon as I felt like falling asleep, her cries would start. They were always the same, starting off with loud wails before fading into sobs and whimpers. I became afraid of the night, afraid to go to sleep and hear the crying woman's cries. I started to believe that I was the only one who could hear her, and that made me feel even more isolated and alone. One night, I decided to investigate. I got out of bed and walked towards the window, peering out into the darkness. But there was no one there. No woman crying, no one to comfort. Just the stillness of the night. I tried to rationalize her existence. Maybe she was a guardian angel expressing her affection weirdly, or maybe I was just delusional. But none of those explanations seemed to make sense. As I got older, the crying woman's cries became more sad than scary. They were filled with so much anguish and despair that I wanted to reach out and comfort her. Yet, every time I opened the window, she was nowhere to be found. I started to wonder if the crying woman was real or just a product of my imagination. Maybe I had conjured her up as a way to cope with my own feelings of loneliness and isolation. But even as I tried to push her cries out of my mind, they remained a constant presence throughout my life. To this day, I still hear the crying woman's cries in my head. They are a haunting reminder of my childhood fears and the darkness that lies within us all. As I grew older, the crying woman's cries became a constant presence in my life. They no longer scared me, but instead filled me with sadness and a desire to comfort her. I would often lay in bed, listening to her cries and wondering who she was and what had happened to her. Despite my attempts to find her, the crying woman remained elusive. I never saw her or found any evidence of her existence. But her cries were always there, starting off with loud wails before fading into sobs and whimpers. As I entered my teenage years, I began to question whether the crying woman was real or just a figment of my imagination. But no matter how hard I tried to dismiss her, she remained a constant presence in my life. In my early 20s, I moved into a dilapidated flat and found myself struggling to make ends meet. It was during this time that the crying woman's cries became a source of comfort for me. They would lull me to sleep during restless nights and remind me that I wasn't alone. But as my life took a downhill slope, the crying woman's cries became more and more frequent. They were no longer just a background noise, but a constant reminder of my own pain and suffering. I began to wonder if the crying woman was trying to tell me something, to warn me of the darkness that lay ahead. But no matter how hard I listened, I could never make out what she was saying. One night, after losing my job and being broken up with by my girlfriend, the crying woman's cries reached a fever pitch. I lay in bed, listening to her cries and feeling more alone than ever before. That's when I snapped. I shouted at the crying woman to shut up, to leave me alone, to stop reminding me of my own pain and suffering. And to my surprise, she did. For the next few nights, I didn't hear from the crying woman. Her absence was both a relief and a source of confusion for me. Had I been the cause of her pain all along? Had my own darkness driven her away? As the nights wore on, I began to hear other sounds instead, fights from the alleyway, angry shouts, ominous thumps, and groans from the rooms around me. The crying woman's absence had only made the other sounds more pronounced and disturbing. But no matter how hard I tried to drown out the noise with earbuds and music, the sounds remained. They were a constant reminder of the darkness that lay around me, threatening to consume me at any moment. And through it all, I couldn't help but wonder where had the crying woman gone and what had become of her. As the sounds around me became more disturbing and pronounced, I found myself struggling to escape them. I bought earbuds and played music on loop, but the sounds still managed to break through. The first sound I heard was the yowling of cats prowling the building. It was a familiar sound, one that I had grown used to hearing in the middle of the night. But now, it seemed louder and more menacing. Next came the resonance of a bass guitar being played across the hallway. It was a slow, haunting melody that seemed to seep into my bones and fill me with a sense of dread. But it was the footsteps that kept me up at night. They were heavy and frantic, and seemed to come from the room above me. Every time I heard them, my heart would race and my palms would sweat. I couldn't help but imagine someone pacing back and forth, waiting for something to happen. And then there were the whispers. Soft, intimate whispers of sweet nothings from the room next to me. They were a constant reminder of my own loneliness and isolation, and made me feel even more alone than ever before. I thumped the wall loudly in frustration, hoping to silence the sounds around me. But it was no use. They continued, day and night, a never-ending symphony of darkness and despair. As the days wore on, I found myself becoming more and more paranoid. I began to suspect that my neighbors were up to something, that they were conspiring against me in some way. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and headed for my neighbor's door. I knocked loudly, my heart pounding in my chest. When the door opened, I saw my neighbor staring back at me in surprise. He had a look of confusion and fear on his face, and I could see the fear in his eyes. I didn't give him a chance to speak. I lunged forward with the knife, plunging it deep into his chest. He let out a scream of agony, and I felt a sick sense of satisfaction wash over me. As I continued to stab him, over and over again, I heard his lover rush out of the room. She let out a shrill wail, piercing and ear-shattering. It was then that I heard the crying woman's wails again. For the first time in years, she was back. And this time, she brought something with her, a deep laughter from within me. As I stood there, covered in blood and surrounded by darkness, I realized that the crying woman had been a warning all along. A warning of the darkness that lay within me and the despair and pain that would eventually consume me. As I stood there, covered in blood and surrounded by darkness, I realized what I had done. My neighbor lay dead at my feet, and his lover was screaming in agony. I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction at what I had done. For a brief moment, the darkness inside me had taken over, and it had felt good. But as the reality of what I had done sunk in, I felt a wave of panic wash over me. I knew that I had to get out of there, to escape before the police arrived. I grabbed a few belongings and fled into the night. As I ran, the crying woman's wails filled my ears, a haunting reminder of what I had done. I found myself wandering the streets, unsure of where to go or what to do. The darkness inside me seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment, and I felt myself becoming more and more lost. Eventually, I found myself at a seedy motel on the outskirts of town. It was a rundown place, filled with the same darkness and despair that I had been trying to escape. But it was there that I met her, a woman who would change everything. She was beautiful and kind, with a warmth that I had never known before. She saw through the darkness inside me, and instead of turning away, she embraced it. For a while, I thought that I had finally found a way out of the darkness. But as the days wore on, the reality of what I had done began to sink in. The guilt and shame consumed me, and I found myself falling deeper into the darkness than ever before. The crying woman's cries became a constant presence in my life once again, a haunting reminder of the darkness that lay within me. And then, one day, I heard a knock at the door. It was the police, and they had come to arrest me for what I had done. As I sat in the back of the police car, the crying woman's wails filled my ears once again. I knew that I had been consumed by the darkness, that I had let it take over me completely. But even as I was led away, I couldn't help but wonder if there was a way out. If there was a way to escape the darkness and find some semblance of peace. As the police car drove away, the crying woman's wails faded into the distance, leaving me alone with my own darkness and despair. In the months that followed, I found myself trapped in a cycle of guilt and despair. The darkness inside me had taken over completely, and I couldn't escape it. I spent my days in a prison cell, surrounded by the same darkness and despair that I had been trying to escape. The crying woman's cries echoed in my ears, a haunting reminder of what I had done. But even as the guilt and shame consumed me, I couldn't help but wonder if there was a way out. If there was a way to escape the darkness and find some semblance of peace. One day, I received a visit from a therapist. She was kind and patient, with a warmth that I had never known before. She saw through the darkness inside me, and instead of turning away, she embraced it. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe there was a way out of the darkness after all. Over the weeks and months that followed, I worked with a therapist to confront my own darkness and understand the root of my pain and suffering. It was a painful process, but one that I knew was necessary if I ever wanted to escape the darkness for good. As I worked through my own pain and suffering, the crying woman's cries began to fade away. They were no longer a constant presence in my life, but a distant memory of my own pain and suffering. In the end, I was able to find a way out of the darkness. It wasn't easy, and it required a lot of hard work and dedication. But with the help of the therapist and my own determination, I was able to confront my own darkness and find some semblance of peace. The crying woman's cries may still haunt me from time to time, but I know that I am stronger than the darkness inside me. And even in my darkest moments, I know that there is always hope for a better tomorrow.